today I'm talking about Status Quo's second studio album, Spare Parts, which turns 55 this year. It was their second album on Pi Records, and the last one to be recorded in the sort of psychedelic pop vein. The next album would be Mark Kelly's Greasy Spoon, which would be much more along the lines of hard rock and boogie and blues music. So this one is really one that I think gets forgotten a bit because it's in that 60s period. I think a lot of fans discovered them in the 1970s with what they were doing, and any stuff that kind of came before that would be accidentally purchased via Pi compilations with contemporary images of the band on it. And I think in some cases perhaps that has soured our relationship a little bit, because you're expecting like hard rocking stuff, and what you get, the expectation and what actually comes out of it, are two different things, you know. This is an album that I didn't really know that much about, if I'm honest with you, because my main focus has always been the boogie rock onwards albums, the stuff that really hit the charts. It kind of goes Pictures of Matchstick Men, Ice in the Sun, and then you skip over a huge chunk until you get like Mark Kelly's and In My Chair and Down the Dustpipe, etc. And while those didn't exactly set the chart alight in the eyes of fans, and based on what went later and the fact that some of those songs were included in live sets for many years, decades, times afterwards, they have a much higher standing, I think, than this material that basically just gets lost by the wayside. Now, with this album, like I said, this gets forgotten a bit because of what they would go on to do. But I would argue, even though this album completely flopped at the time, and I'm sure Quo were on the cusp of being dropped from the label. I'm sure I've read stories of John Schroeder like just ignoring people, like trying to avoid people in order to keep the Quo journey going a bit longer, because as Francis has said before in documentaries, he thought, well, the Quo were like that far away, like a tiny little bit away from greatness. And Francis always says quite modestly, well, he was wrong, of course. It's like, well, no, that this just wasn't the path they were supposed to be on. And while on the internet, when you look, it says continuing on basically from Picturesque, I would argue this isn't the same. This isn't really the psychedelic Status Quo. It's more like the sort of soft pop edge of Status Quo with added strings and horns and all kinds of things. They're really throwing the kitchen sink at it. And as you might gather as I get more into this, the production kind of lets it down on a major scale, because the underlying compositions have this sort of there's something there, you know. They really are at this point in this genre, I think, not too far away from greatness. So Face Without a Soul is one I think that often got included on Pi compilations. Really catchy. That chorus, you know, really works. I love the piano in the verses that really lift it. That's Roy Lynes on piano. And yeah, the way in which it leads up, I think maybe that there's too many horns and stuff in there. Perhaps the production's a bit too big. And the problem you find with this album is that there's just so much packed in. It's like they're in a box and they're just pouring lots of different things in, and it's just trying to like burst out. It's like you're expecting something to kind of change. It's a bit like when people listen to the beginning of Hard Time from Rockin' All Over the World. They were kind of expecting the beginning to then go into like a Blue for You type sound, when in actual fact it just stayed where it was. I think this has a very similar issue from the copies that I've heard. You're just what I was looking for today is a Goffin King composition, and again it's sort of on that psychedelic thing, but with Alan's vocal there, I really like Alan's vocals in this era. I think it sounds very different. I think it doesn't sound like the usual kind of 1960s there's like an archetypal, I think, 60s vocal, and Alan, I think, kind of diverts away from that. It's very distinctive, I think. I love the guitar sound in that, the sort of that sort of thing. Really, really cool sounding guitars on that. So Are You Growing Tired of My Love is a lead vocal for Rick, and I think this was supposed to, like, I guess they wanted to release this and, for them to become some kind of like heartthrobbly type stuff. But when you look at the Beat Club performance, they're going for that psychedelic angle again. Beat Club sort of had this thing, didn't they, with all the background stuff that went on, rather than just focusing on the performance. And I feel like there's one in this case of like all kinds of shapes and things. The song itself is okay. It's an Anthony King composition. It's maybe something, it was possibly done to like emphasize Rick as a singer, right? And the stuff around there, it sort of feels like the band are just going through the motions, though. It feels like it was picked for them, and this just doesn't quite gel. Like, it's a good song, and I really like Quo's version of it, and Rick's vocals at this point. He had, he was a good rocker, but he also had a really good kind of gentle voice. Antique Angelique is the next track, and it's the first track written in collaboration with Bob Young. Where have I heard that name before? He's been on so many things. All you have to do is type in Bob Young Status Quo, and you'll see a huge list, and it all starts here. And I love the lyrical thing of like they're trying to tell a story. So it's like there's a grandfather clock in the corner with a smile on his face. It's like that's trying to be sort of psychedelic and a bit edgy, but actually that it's interesting lyrically. It makes you think. I've always liked the chorus of it. The chorus has got a really nice catchy thing. Again, just let down by the production. There's just too much in there. Just calm it down, guys. Too much going on. Just my personal opinion, though. So we go on to track number 5, So Ends Another Life. This is a Lancaster composition, and oh, my goodness. I mean, it's so beautiful, and it was actually the B-side, I think, to Are You Growing Tired of My Love? I'm sure I read, and it should have been the A-side. Like, it's such a good track because it's Rick in vocal mode again, in singer mode. And it almost sounds like, to me, and there's a few things on there that have this, that like movie quality, the way in which you have sort of the understated chorus, and then it goes into that beautiful middle eight, was like, it's a time to care, and it's like the strings behind it. This is a one time when the strings are like properly emphasized and like it really works, and again mixed properly. It would have been hairs on the back of the neck standing up, and that's not like when they go into boogie mode. That's like, this is just a beautiful piece of music. And Alan and Rick have a knack of being able to sell these pieces, and I think when you look at what Alan's writing in this period, some really interesting and quite dark imagery. I mean, so ends another life. I mean, we go into the second part, the big chorus, the chorusy bit, so ends another, that bit. Can you tell? I'm all over the place because I love this track. The understatedness of so ends another, that bit. And then we have the big chorus with the horns and stuff. Maybe a tiny bit overkill, but still really, really cool. And one of Alan's best written tracks, I think. So, Poor Old Man, Rossi Parfitt song, which I always skipped because the intro just didn't grab me. Used to skip it a lot. whenever I heard it on Spotify or whatever. And then recently I thought, oh, I'll give that a listen. I love John's drumming on this. I think the sound is spot on for the drums. But I do think in terms of a composition, I think the verses and the chorus don't match. They sort of go into like a different time signature or something, which is really interesting. But it kind of takes me out of it because you're like, yeah, I'm in this kind of verse mode that kind of drives along, and we've got guitar in the background, and you know the way in which the vocals are doubled on there. We got Rossi's doubled vocals. That's brilliant. But then it goes into like this big thing that's a bit like So Ends Another Life, I guess. It's like really big with like those horns and stuff. And personally, yeah, after a few listens, I got used to it. But at first, I was like, these two don't seem to match. But I do think this is something that might have worked quite well when they did the acoustic stuff later on. In fact, a lot of compositions from this era, they should have done like a half 60s thing of all the 60s stuff, because it gets overlooked, you know. And I think that's what I found with Poor Old Man, is that I often listen to it and I just found the first few bars of it very underwhelming, but it did get better and I did enjoy it. Track number 7 is Mr. Mind Detector, and I think somebody obviously was trying to do a John Lennon. I mean, it's very along those lines, isn't it? It's sort of the stuff that that the Beatles were doing around this, just before this period, I guess, that sort of psychedelic thing. And that's kind of what this feels like. And again, there's a very kind of movie thing, because it's a very understated beginning with that bass, with Alan's bass there. And then it goes bigger and bigger and bigger. And yeah, again, another thing that could have been a Bond theme or something to do with espionage. It's a track that I often go back to because I just think they were onto something. It's perhaps not the most, innovative of tracks, but for what it is, I really liked the way in which they put that together. But it could have been better, I think. So The Clown is one of those songs where Rick's vocals again, I love the distorted feeling of those vocals and the big orchestral. I'd love to know how they recorded this. Was the orchestra recorded separately, or is it in one big session, at once? Because it kind of feels like the latter, if I'm honest with you. But yeah, I love Rick's vocals on that, and the guitar, that prominent sort of acousticy, electric-y guitar is really cool. Velvet Curtains is another one. It's very much following on from the previous album, isn't it? But the vocals from All Concerned is fantastic. When I Awake is another one, a bit like Poor Old Man. Always kind of skipped it, but I love the chorus to this. The chorus and all of these things are really strong and could have been built up into something really, kind of iconic. I love it. I love most of what Quo do in any era, to be honest, but trying to be objective, sometimes the songs like When I Awake are perhaps just a little bit too derivative or to what has been done before, to use a better phrase, I guess, or a different phrase, but I like it anyway. So we go to the closing of this, and I would argue that Nothing at All is the best track on the album, because we start off with Francis Rossi's vocal and guitar, and there's a lot of really dark lyrics in this album. Lots of really dark stuff going on right in the lyrics when you listen, from Poor Old Man to perhaps Mr. Mind Detector, and then Nothing at All, When I Awake, So Ends Another Life. I mean, it's not exactly the happiest of notes at times, but nothing at all with that guitar. And I love like the harmonies at the end, and the harmonies throughout this album are actually really strong for a band that are still learning the ropes. And so, yeah, when those strings come in and you hear that section of close your eyes, there's nothing more to see, close your eyes and thank the world you're free. I mean, wow. Like, I remember the first time I heard it, was like, you get this rush. And I love like I said, the harmonies and Francis Rossi's doubled vocals at the end. In this era, despite sounding really, really young, he can do a double vocal, man. Like, there's something about his double vocal that lifts a track up and says, I am here. I mean, it's so like distinctive as well. And it's a skill I think that he would utilize throughout his career. Especially from, I'd say, Rockin' All Over the World onwards, when that was more of a prominent thing again, trying to be more prominent in the thing. But what a vocal performance. And when it comes into that last thing, and there's all that instrumentation, and this is one of those instances where it actually works, because that slightly distorted quality gives a sense of urgency and energy. And it just lifts. And I feel like perhaps with that in mind, there were missed opportunities here, really big missed opportunities, because, yeah, they obviously released Are You Growing Tired of My Love because it's a poppy tune, right? They thought it was going to catch on perhaps in terms of its melody and its chorus, and it's a bit heartthrobby, a bit boy bandy from that period. But yeah, there are other tracks on here where with a little bit more polish, they could have, or just doing nothing at all, if you pardon the pun, to it, would just be brilliant. Nothing at all as a single by Status Quo in 1969 might have hit somewhere, would have been a bit dark, but a lot of these, they could have been singles in some ways, but my vote would be for Nothing at All, because what a track. What a track, and what an album, despite the fact that this did absolutely nothing, this album, when it was released, and one of the reasons why I'm talking about it, because I've always kind of avoided the 60s stuff, if I'm honest. The reason why I've started talking about it is because the band are talking about it. They've just released some merchandise to celebrate 55 years of this album that no one really knows about, and people kind of skip over. And if you ever hear anyone say again, all Status Quo material sounds the same, point them towards this, because it doesn't have the psychedelicness, so much psychedelicness of Matchstick Men. It's perhaps trying to copy different things, which I think is what members of the band or people associated with the band have hinted at before. But it's just something completely different that showcases that this is a band that were working their way up. Years before going in the clubs, a year or two before going rock and roll, they were working their way up. And it's a journey that started, back in 1962, then with, going onwards with the Spectres and Butlins and everything else. This is the culmination of that era coming to an end, going into the next phase. And I think a lot of times, that first initial phase from the 60s, mid-60s to late, is completely forgotten. This is an era, I think, that as time goes on, will be appraised even more. And yeah, oh my goodness, like, I had no idea how good it was, how good it could be and could have been. And I would love if they did a remix of it one day. But what an album. That's Spare Parts, turning 55 years old this year.